Imagine this. You're going about your day, minding your own business, when suddenly, someone calls the police on you. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because of how you look. Now, imagine the twist. The person calling the police has no idea who you really are. This isn't just a hypothetical scenario. This actually happened. And the story that unfolds is one of those moments that makes you stop and think about the world we live in. It's a story about assumptions, power dynamics, and the unexpected turns life can take. It's a story that starts in a bank, with a white bank manager, a black man, and a 911 call that changes everything. The day began like any other. The bank was bustling with its usual rhythm. Customers depositing checks, tellers counting cash, and the faint hum of printers in the background. The bank manager, let's call him Mark, was at his desk, reviewing paperwork. Mark had been with the bank for over a decade. He prided himself on running a tight ship, ensuring everything was in order. He was the kind of guy who followed the rules to a T, and he expected everyone else to do the same. To him, the bank was more than just a workplace. It was a reflection of his values: order, professionalism, and trust. Then, he walked in. Let's call him James. James was dressed casually, in a simple button-up shirt and slacks. He didn't look like the typical customer who came into the bank. He wasn't wearing a suit or carrying a briefcase. He didn't have the air of someone who belonged in the world of high finance. But appearances can be deceiving, and James was about to prove that in the most dramatic way possible. James approached the counter, calm and composed. He asked to speak with the manager. The teller, unsure of what to make of him, hesitated for a moment before calling Mark over. Mark walked up, his professional smile in place, but his eyes scanning James with a hint of suspicion. "How can I help you?" Mark asked, his tone polite but guarded. James didn't mince words. "I need access to some records," he said. "It's regarding the bank's recent transactions." Mark's eyebrows furrowed. This wasn't a usual request, and James didn't look like someone who should be asking for such sensitive information. Mark's mind started racing. Who was this guy? Why did he need these records? Was he trying to pull some kind of scam? Mark's instincts kicked in. He decided to play it safe. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice firm. "I can't provide that information without proper authorization." James didn't flinch. "I understand," he replied, "but I think you'll find that I do have the proper authorization." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the counter. Mark picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he read the name and title. His heart skipped a beat. The card identified James as the owner of the bank. Mark's mind went blank for a moment. This couldn't be right. The owner of the bank? Here? Now? Looking like this? Mark's first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe the card was fake. Maybe James was trying to pull a fast one. Mark's suspicion only grew. He decided to test the waters. "I'm going to need to verify this," he said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. James nodded, unfazed. "Go ahead," he said, "but I suggest you hurry. I don't have all day." Mark stepped away, his mind racing. He called the bank's corporate office, hoping to get some clarity, but the line was busy. He tried again. Still nothing. The more he tried, the more frustrated he became. And the more frustrated he became, the more convinced he was that something wasn't right. His suspicion turned to fear. What if this guy was dangerous? What if he was trying to steal something? Mark couldn't take any chances. He had to protect the bank, his employees, his customers. He had to do something. That's when he made the decision. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. "There's a man here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "He's claiming to be the owner of the bank, but I don't believe him. He's asking for sensitive information, and I think he might be trying to commit fraud. I need someone here right away." The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way. Mark hung up, his heart pounding. He glanced back at James, who was still standing at the counter, calm as ever. Mark felt a mix of relief and dread. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? But as the minutes ticked by, Mark's confidence began to waver. What if he was wrong? What if James really was who he said he was? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He tried to push it away, but it lingered. gnawing at the edges of his mind. And then he heard the sirens. The police were here. Mark took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was about to happen. He walked back to the counter, where James was still waiting. "The police are here," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. James didn't react. He just looked at Mark, his expression unreadable. The doors swung open, and two officers walked in, their eyes scanning the room. Mark pointed to James. "That's him," he said. The officers approached, their hands resting on their belts, ready for anything. "Sir," one of them said, addressing James, "we need to ask you a few questions." James nodded, still calm, still composed. "Of course," he said. "But before you do, I think you should call your supervisor. Tell them James Carter is here." The officers exchanged a glance. One of them stepped aside, speaking into his radio. Mark watched, his stomach in knots. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the officer's expression change. The color drained from his face. He turned back to James, his demeanor shifting completely. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice respectful now. "We're so sorry for the misunderstanding. We'll handle this right away." Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. Mr. Carter? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but it was too late. The damage was done. The officers turned to Mark, their eyes hard. "We need to have a word with you," one of them said. Mark's heart sank. He looked at James, who was now watching him with a mix of pity and disappointment. And in that moment, Mark realized the gravity of his mistake. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. What happened next would change everything. For Mark, for James, and for everyone involved. But that's a story for the next part. For now, let's just say this. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes come from the smallest assumptions. And sometimes, those mistakes can cost you everything. Mark stood frozen as the officers approached him, their expressions stern but unreadable. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more panicked than the last. How had this happened? How had he misread the situation so badly? He glanced at James, who was now sitting calmly in one of the bank's plush chairs, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with an air of quiet authority. Mark's stomach churned. He had never felt so small, so exposed. The bank, once his domain, now felt like a stage where he was the unwitting villain. The officers led Mark to a quiet corner of the bank, away from the curious eyes of customers and employees. "Sir," one of them began, his tone firm but not unkind, "we need to understand what happened here. Can you walk us through your thought process when you made the call?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain it? How could he justify what he'd done without sounding like the person he was afraid he might be? He took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. I thought he was a threat," Mark stammered. "He didn't look like he belonged here. He was asking for sensitive information, and I didn't believe he had the authority to access it. I thought I was protecting the bank." The officers exchanged a glance, their faces unreadable. One of them nodded slowly, jotting something down in a small notebook. "And did you verify his identity before making the call?" the other officer asked. Mark hesitated. I tried," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I called corporate, but the line was busy. I didn't know what else to do." The officers didn't respond immediately, and the silence felt heavy, suffocating. Mark's mind raced. What would happen now? Would he lose his job? Would there be legal consequences? The weight of his actions was starting to crush him. Meanwhile, James remained seated, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. He watched as the officers spoke with Mark, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. He didn't seem angry, exactly, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze that made it clear he wasn't going to let this slide. James had been in situations like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. He knew what it felt like to be judged, to be underestimated, to be seen as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. But this time was different. This time, he had the power to do something about it. As the officers continued their questioning, James pulled out his phone and began typing a message. He wasn't sure yet what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about him. This was about something bigger, something deeper. It was about the assumptions people make, the biases they carry, and the consequences of those biases. James had spent his life building his career, working his way up from nothing to become one of the most successful businessmen in the city. He had faced countless obstacles along the way, but he had never let them stop him. And now, as he sat in the bank he owned, watching the man who had called the police on him squirm under the weight of his own mistakes, James felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, yes, but also sadness and even a flicker of pity. Back in the corner, Mark was struggling to keep his composure. The officers had finished their initial questioning, but they weren't done with him yet. "We're going to need to take a formal statement," one of them said, "and we'll need to speak with your superiors as well." Mark nodded numbly, his mind racing. He thought about his wife, his kids, the life he had built. How could he explain this to them? How could he make them understand? He felt a lump rise in his throat, but he forced it down. He couldn't fall apart now. Not here. Not in front of everyone. As the officers stepped away to make a call, Mark glanced around the bank. The customers were whispering to each other, their eyes darting between him and James. The employees were trying to act normal, but he could see the tension in their faces. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. Mark felt a surge of desperation. He needed to fix this. He needed to make it right. But how? He looked at James, who was still sitting calmly, his phone in his hand. Mark took a deep breath and walked over to him, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Carter," Mark began, his voice trembling. I want to apologize. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. I didn't know who you were, and I let my assumptions get the better of me. I'm so sorry." James looked up at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he nodded slowly. "I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't just about me, Mark. This is about something much bigger. Do you understand that?" Mark nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he did. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see if he would fall or be pulled back to safety. Before James could say anything else, the officers returned. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, "we've spoken with your office and everything checks out. We're sorry for the inconvenience. Is there anything else you need from us?" James shook his head. "No, thank you," he said. "I think we're done here." The officers nodded and left, leaving Mark and James alone in the middle of the bank. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Mark felt like he was suffocating. He needed to say something, to do something, but he didn't. "Know what?" James stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Mark, his eyes searching. "This isn't the end of this conversation," he said. "But for now, I have work to do. We'll talk again soon." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mark standing there, his mind reeling. He watched as James disappeared into the back office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Mark felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. As the bank slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Mark retreated to his office, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He sat down at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him, but he couldn't focus. All he could think about was James, the look in his eyes, the weight of his words. Mark had always considered himself a good person, someone who treated everyone with respect. But now, he wasn't so sure. Had he been blind to his own biases? Had he been part of the problem without even realizing it? The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the bank floor. The day was almost over, but for Mark, it felt like it was just beginning. He knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be easy. There would be consequences, conversations, maybe even changes he wasn't ready for. But as he sat there, staring at the closed door of James's office, he realized something else. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that went beyond this bank, this moment, this mistake. And as much as he wanted to turn back the clock, to undo what he had done, he knew he couldn't. All he could do was face whatever came next and hope that, Somehow, he could find a way to make things right. But for now, the tension remained, unresolved and simmering just beneath the surface. The story was far from over, and the next chapter was going to be even more intense. What would James do next? How would Mark handle the fallout? And what would this mean for the bank, for its employees, for its customers? The answers were still out of reach, hidden in the shadows of the evening. All anyone could do was wait and see.